On what should have been the happiest day of her life, Sophia Carter was publicly humiliated at the altar. Accused of something she never did. But the real betrayal? The man she loved hesitated when she needed him most. In that moment, she made a choice that would change everything. She walked away. But where would she go next? And could she ever rebuild what was broken? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Sophia Carter had always imagined her wedding morning to be filled with joy, excitement, and a nervous kind of happiness. She had pictured waking up to sunlight filtering through the curtains, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air, her heart pounding with anticipation at the thought of walking down the aisle toward the man she loved. But reality had a cruel way of shattering expectations. As she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling of the grand bridal suite, there was no fluttering excitement, no breathless anticipation. Instead, there was an unsettling stillness inside her, a quiet unease she couldn't quite explain. The lavish room around her, the silk-draped windows, the delicate floral arrangements, the perfectly arranged white satin gown hanging by the vanity, felt suffocating rather than beautiful. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in, whispering a warning she had tried for months to ignore. A gentle knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Before she could respond, Rachel stepped inside, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "Morning, bride," Rachel said, her voice warm but teasing as she set the cup down on the nightstand. She perched on the edge of the bed, studying Sophia's face with sharp, knowing eyes. Sophia forced a smile as she sat up, wrapping her fingers around the cup to anchor herself. "Morning." Rachel didn't buy it. "Okay, that was the weakest morning I've ever heard. What's wrong?" "Nothing," Sophia said too quickly. Then, realizing how unconvincing that sounded, she let out a breath. "I don't know. I guess I'm just nervous." Rachel tilted her head. Nervous like, "Oh my God, I'm getting married, holy crap," or nervous like, "Something feels off and I might need to run." Sophia let out a small laugh, but it lacked real amusement. "The first one," she hesitated. "I think." Rachel narrowed her eyes, but before she could press further, Sophia's phone vibrated on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen. A voice message from Ethan. Her heart skipped, a reaction she wasn't sure was excitement or dread. With a slow breath, she pressed play. "Good morning, my love." Ethan's deep, familiar voice filled the room, low and soft. "I can't wait to see you. I know it's going to be a perfect day. I love you." Sophia closed her eyes as she listened, letting the words wash over her. She wanted to believe in them, wanted to hold on to the promise they carried. But there it was again, that whisper of unease, that tiny, insidious doubt curling in the back of her mind like smoke. Rachel watched her carefully. "And? How do we feel about that?" Sophia exhaled, setting the phone down without replying. "I love him," she said, more to herself than Rachel, but the moment the words left her lips, she felt the same strange hollowness she'd been feeling for months. Rachel didn't push. She simply stood and clapped her hands. "Well, too late for existential crises now. We've got a wedding to get to. Your mom and the others are next door getting ready. I told them I'd check on you first." Sophia nodded, taking a sip of coffee, letting its warmth settle in her. "Thanks, Rach." "Always," Rachel said, then grinned. "Now let's get you into that overpriced piece of art you call a dress." An hour later, Sophia stood in front of the full-length mirror, fully transformed. The dress, a masterpiece of white silk and lace, fit her like a dream, hugging her curves in all the right places, flowing elegantly to the floor. The intricate embroidery shimmered under the soft lighting, the delicate beading catching every flicker of movement. Against her warm brown skin, the white looked ethereal. Rachel fastened the last clasp at the back and stepped back, admiring her handiwork. "Damn, girl. If I were into women, I'd marry you myself." Sophia let out a laugh, finally feeling a small flicker of warmth in her chest. "That might be the best compliment I've gotten today." She turned slightly, studying her reflection. She looked stunning, elegant, composed, and yet beneath the surface that tight knot of anxiety hadn't disappeared. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers hovering over the screen. Rachel watched her in the mirror. "You don't have to answer." "I know," Sophia murmured, but she pressed play anyway. This time, Ethan's voice was lower, more hesitant. "Hey, Soph. Just wanted to say, I love you, and I hope you're okay. I'll see you soon." Something about the way he said it, something in his tone, made her chest tighten. Was it just nerves? Or was there something else? Before she could overthink it, Rachel gently took the phone from her hands and set it aside. "All right, enough of that. Let's focus on making you the most drop-dead gorgeous bride this town has ever seen." Sophia let herself be pulled into the moment, allowing Rachel to adjust her veil, touch up her makeup, and fuss over every last detail. But deep down, she knew she wasn't just battling wedding jitters. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Across town, in the grand Callaway estate, Ethan sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched coffee in front of him. His crisp white shirt was neatly pressed, his navy suit hanging nearby, waiting. But he wasn't thinking about his wedding day. He was thinking about his mother. Victoria Callaway sat at the head of the table, poised as ever, sipping her tea with the quiet elegance of a woman who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of control. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection, her emerald earrings sparkling under the morning light. But Ethan knew better than to be fooled by appearances. His father, Charles Callaway, sat beside her, silent as usual, reading the newspaper with little interest in the conversation. His younger sister, Lillian, sat across from him, her gaze darting between their mother and Ethan, as if sensing the tension brewing beneath the surface. Victoria set her cup down delicately. "I suppose it's too late for you to change your mind." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Yes, Mother, it is." Charles barely looked up. "You know how we feel about this, son. We've made our concerns clear." Lillian shot Ethan a sympathetic glance, but she didn't say anything. She had learned long ago that speaking against their mother was a battle rarely won. Young exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I don't need another lecture. I love Sophia. That's all that matters." Victoria tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Love is important, dear, but so is understanding the world we live in. This isn't just about you and Sophia. It's about legacy, family expectations." Ethan's grip tightened around his coffee cup. "You mean your expectations?" Victoria didn't flinch. "I mean that this will never be easy. Not for you, not for her." Lillian finally spoke up, her voice softer than usual. "Ethan, don't let them get to you. If Sophia makes you happy, that's all that should matter." Victoria cast a glance at her daughter, but said nothing. Instead, she turned her gaze back to Ethan, her voice smooth, composed. "Just think about what I said." Ethan pushed back his chair abruptly. "I've already thought about it." He stood, straightened his sleeves. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a wedding to get to." As he left the room, Victoria and Charles exchanged a glance. It was clear neither of them believed this marriage would last, and Victoria Calloway had no intention of letting it happen. The grand cathedral stood tall against the morning sky, its towering spires casting long shadows over the pristine marble steps leading to its entrance. White roses lined the walkway, their delicate petals swaying gently in the cool breeze. Inside, a sea of guests filled the pews, dressed in tailored suits and elegant gowns, their hushed conversations blending into a low hum that reverberated through the vaulted ceilings. Sophia Carter arrived with her family, stepping out of the car with careful precision, her father's steady hand supporting her as she adjusted the train of her dress. The moment her heels touched the stone pavement, she felt the weight of every stare, every curious glance, every polite yet assessing smile. It wasn't admiration, it was scrutiny. She had grown used to it over the years, the way people from Ethan's world looked at her, as though she were something to be examined, studied, and ultimately tolerated. The Calloway guests, overwhelmingly white and affluent, whispered behind the rims of their crystal champagne flutes, their words just soft enough to remain deniable, but sharp enough to cut. "She certainly is striking," one woman murmured, her voice laced with something unreadable. "A bold choice of dress," another added, though whether it was meant as a compliment or a veiled criticism, Sophia couldn't tell. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. This was her wedding day. She was marrying the man she loved. That was all that mattered. Her father, Jonathan Carter, stood tall beside her, his military posture unshaken, his gaze sweeping the crowd with quiet authority. Her mother, Laura, fussed with an invisible crease on Sophia's sleeve, her lips pressed into a tight line as if she could feel the unspoken judgment circling them like vultures. Rachel, of course, was less diplomatic. "I swear to God, if one more person gives you that look, I'm throwing hands," she muttered under her breath, adjusting the strap of her bridesmaid dress. Sophia let out a small, breathy laugh. "Please, don't start a fight in the middle of my wedding." Rachel smirked. "I make no promises." Before Sophia could respond, a familiar, all-too-perfect voice interrupted. "You look lovely." Sophia turned to see Victoria Calloway approaching, her expression unreadable. Dressed in an ivory silk ensemble that was just a shade too close to white for comfort, Victoria was the very picture of effortless elegance. Her blonde hair was pinned into a chignon so precise it could have been carved from marble, her pearl earrings catching the light with every measured step she took. "The dress," Victoria added, offering a pleasant yet impersonal smile, "is quite traditional. A bold choice." Sophia recognized the insult hidden beneath the polite veneer. She smiled, matching Victoria's carefully composed expression. "Thank you." Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if assessing her one last time. "You can still change your mind, you know." Sophia's fingers curled at her sides. "I won't." A moment stretched between them, a silent battle neither woman acknowledged out loud. Then, with the ease of a practiced socialite, Victoria stepped aside, allowing Sophia and her family to enter. "Well then," she said, her tone light, almost amused, "let's hope everything goes smoothly." A chill ran down Sophia's spine, but she didn't look back. Inside the cathedral, the air was thick with candlelight and expectation. White roses adorned the ends of the pews, their scent mingling with the faint, polished aroma of old wood and burning wax. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the sea of faces watching her. The pews at the front were filled with the Calloway family, Ethan's relatives, business associates, and high society friends, all dressed in refined, muted tones. The men wore expertly tailored suits in deep navy and charcoal, the women in pastel gowns that spoke of understated luxury. They spoke in hushed voices, exchanging pleasantries. But their eyes occasionally flickered toward the back, where Sophia's family and friends were beginning to take their places. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Sophia's side of the church, though dressed just as elegantly, carried themselves differently. There was warmth in their interactions, laughter that came more freely, expressions that were open and unguarded. They filled the space in a way that disrupted the rigid, curated perfection of the Calloway guests. From her seat in the front pew, Victoria watched everything unfold, her eyes never leaving the entrance. An older woman beside her leaned in slightly. "Well," she murmured, barely masking her curiosity, "this certainly is an interesting crowd." Victoria smiled tightly. "Yes," she said, her gaze never wavering from the doors. "It is." Across the room, Ethan stood near the altar, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with nervous precision. His best man, a longtime friend from university, clapped him on the back. "She'll be here any second now," he said with a grin. "You good?" Ethan forced a chuckle. "Yeah, just anxious." His friend smirked. "You're about to marry the love of your life, man. Nothing to be nervous about." Ethan nodded but didn't respond. Instead, his gaze drifted toward his mother. Victoria's expression was composed, unreadable, but he knew her well enough to recognize the stiffness in her posture, the slight press of her fingers against the fabric of her dress. She was waiting for something. Near the entrance, Jonathan Carter straightened his tie, his sharp gaze scanning the room. He was not a man easily intimidated, but he knew how to read a room, and he knew exactly what kind of gathering this was. Laura stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "They're watching us," she said quietly. Jonathan's expression didn't change. "Let them." Laura exhaled slowly. "I just want this to go smoothly." Jonathan glanced at his daughter. "So do I." The music shifted. A hush fell over the crowd. It was time. The bridesmaids began their procession down the aisle, one by one, their dresses flowing gracefully with each step. Rachel was the last to go, pausing just long enough to give Sophia's hand a reassuring squeeze before stepping forward. Sophia's heart pounded against her ribs as she tightened her grip around her father's arm. The grand wooden doors creaked open. A wave of silence washed over the room. All eyes turned to her. For a brief moment, the weight of it all became suffocating. She was used to standing out, used to being noticed. But this wasn't admiration. This was judgment. Ethan's eyes met hers from across the hall. He smiled, but there was tension in his shoulders, a stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there before. She took a breath and stepped forward. The walk down the aisle felt endless. She could feel the whispers behind her, the barely concealed murmurs hidden beneath the swell of the music. "Gorgeous," someone whispered. "Bold choice of dress," another murmured. "She certainly is. Striking." Sophia forced herself to focus on Ethan, on his face, on his smile. None of this mattered. Once she reached him, it would all fade away. Finally, she arrived at the altar. Ethan took her hands in his, and for the first time that day, she felt something solid, something real. The officiant cleared his throat. "We have gathered here today to witness the union of two people who have chosen love above all else." Sophia tried to let his words settle over her, to focus only on Ethan, but she could still feel it. The stares, the whispers, the expectations pressing down on her like an invisible force. And from the front pew, Victoria watched her with careful, calculating eyes. Sophia suddenly understood. She wasn't just marrying Ethan. She was marrying into this. And something told her the worst had yet to come. The hush that had settled over the cathedral was thick, almost tangible, stretching over the gathered guests like a fragile veil. Sophia stood at the altar, her hands in Ethan's, feeling the steady warmth of his touch, the way his fingers tightened slightly around hers as if to reassure her, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe it, that whatever tension had followed them here, whatever unspoken doubts had trailed behind them like shadows, none of it mattered. The officiant's voice rang through the vaulted space, measured and calm. "Marriage is the foundation of love and trust, the bonding of two souls who choose to walk this life together." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open. A murmur rippled through the congregation. It was quiet at first, a subtle shift in posture, a few curious glances cast toward the back of the room. But then came the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Slow, deliberate steps, cutting through the stillness. Sophia's grip on Ethan's hands tightened instinctively, a slow prickle of unease creeping up her spine. Victoria Calloway stepped forward. Dressed in an ivory silk gown that draped elegantly around her frame, she moved with practiced grace, her expression one of composed dignity. In her hands, she held a small velvet box, rich navy blue, the kind of box meant to house something precious. A sharp, quiet gasp echoed from somewhere in the pews. The officiant hesitated, his words trailing off, uncertain. All eyes were on Victoria now, watching as she approached the front of the church with the ease of someone who had always commanded attention. Ethan's body went rigid beside Sophia. His fingers twitched against hers, but he said nothing. Victoria inhaled softly, as if steadying herself for something particularly distasteful, then turned to face the guests, her voice measured and smooth. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, the picture of dignified regret. "But before this ceremony continues, there is something that must be addressed." The murmur of voices grew, swelling like an incoming tide. Sophia felt her pulse spike, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Victoria lifted the velvet box and, with a slow, deliberate motion, opened it. Inside, nestled against the dark fabric, was an emerald bracelet, gleaming under the golden light of the chandelier above. For a moment, the sight of it meant nothing to Sophia. It was just another piece of expensive jewelry, another glittering heirloom that Victoria had undoubtedly kept locked away in some family vault. But then Victoria spoke again, and the weight of her words sent ice through Sophia's veins. "This bracelet," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the church, "has been in our family for generations. It belonged to my grandmother, was passed down to me. It disappeared yesterday." Silence fell, thick and oppressive. The world seemed to slow, as if holding its breath. Victoria's gaze shifted, landing on Sophia with the precision of a dagger. "And this morning it was found." A pause. in the hands of a housekeeper who claimed she saw Sophia near it the night before. The room erupted, a wave of murmurs, hushed gasps, the rustling of fabric as guests shifted in their seats. A few exchanged knowing glances, subtle but damning. Others, those from Sophia's side, stiffened, recognizing what this was, even if they had yet to find the words for it. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse roared in her ears. Her mind scrambled to process what had just been said. She had never seen that bracelet before in her life. And yet, there it was in Victoria's hands, a carefully placed weapon disguised as an heirloom. Her father was the first to react. Jonathan Carter stepped forward, his presence solid, unwavering. His voice was low but sharp as a blade. "Are you accusing my daughter of stealing from your family, Victoria?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, her expression an artful blend of concern and carefully measured regret. "I am simply suggesting that this is a delicate matter, one that deserves to be addressed before we proceed with something as sacred as a wedding. Surely we can all agree that trust is the foundation of marriage." Jonathan's jaw tensed. He had spent a lifetime in rooms where men with power tried to manipulate truth. He had seen tactics like this before, had learned to recognize when a battle was already unfairly rigged. He turned his gaze to Ethan. "And what do you have to say about this, son?" The word son landed heavy in the air, a pointed reminder that Ethan was the one who should have shut this down the moment it started. Sophia turned to him too, searching his face, hoping, pleading for the certainty she needed, for the words that would cut through this madness. But Ethan didn't speak right away. His fingers twitched against hers, his throat bobbed as he swallowed. And then, finally, I think we should talk about this," he said. The ground beneath Sophia might as well have collapsed. A sharp, incredulous laugh burst from Rachel, who had been silent until now. She stepped forward, fury radiating off her in waves. "Talk about what?" she snapped. "Talk about how your mother just stood up in front of an entire church and tried to humiliate Sophia with some manufactured drama? Are you serious?" Victoria turned to Rachel with a thin, tight-lipped smile. "I'm not sure it's your place to involve yourself in this matter." Rachel scoffed. "Oh, trust me, I am making it my place." Sophia barely heard them. The world around her had gone distant, muted, like sound through water. She could still see the way the guests were looking at her, their expressions shifting, recalibrating. They had come here for a wedding. Now they were watching a spectacle, a trial. She had spent years proving herself, forcing herself into a space that had never truly welcomed her, convincing herself that love was enough. And yet here she stood, in the middle of an altar, accused of something so ridiculous, so insulting, and the man she was about to marry had hesitated. She turned back to Ethan. He was looking at her now, something unreadable in his expression. Not anger, not outrage, not even disbelief, just hesitation. Sophia felt something inside her fracture. She swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have never seen that bracelet before in my life." Victoria's expression didn't shift, but the corners of her mouth curved ever so slightly. "Then I suppose this is just a most unfortunate coincidence." The murmurs grew louder. The doubt had already taken root. And Sophia understood something then. Something that should have been obvious long before today. This wasn't just about a missing bracelet. It was never about a bracelet. This was about making sure she knew, once and for all, that she would never belong. Ethan turned to her, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Soph, if you know anything about this, just tell me. We can fix it." Sophia exhaled sharply, the sound barely more than a breath. Rachel cursed under hers. Her father let out a low, humorless chuckle. Her mother remained perfectly, chillingly still. And Sophia, she simply pulled her hand from Ethan's. His expression faltered. His body tensed. "Sophia?" "No." Her voice was clear, unwavering. No more proving herself. No more explaining herself. She lifted her chin, her heart pounding. "I hope you're happy, Victoria." Victoria smiled. And Sophia, with every ounce of dignity she had left, took a slow step back. Then, with steady fingers, she reached up and removed the engagement ring from her hand. A collective gasp rippled through the church. Ethan's eyes widened. "Sophia, wait." But she was already turning, already walking away. And she did not look back. Sophia's heels clicked against the polished marble floor, each step echoing through the cathedral like the final beats of a funeral march. The silence behind her was deafening. It pressed against her back, heavy with the weight of hundreds of eyes, some wide with shock, others sharp with curiosity. And then there were those few, those who had never wanted her here to begin with, whose gazes burned with quiet satisfaction. She didn't care, not anymore. The engagement ring in her hand felt like a dead weight, the cool metal pressing against her palm. Just minutes ago, it had been a symbol of promise, of love, of a future she had believed in with everything she had. Now it was nothing more than a lie, a carefully crafted illusion that had shattered the moment Ethan had hesitated. The doors loomed ahead, massive and ornate, but somehow suffocating, like the very last barrier between her and the life she had spent years trying to fit into. She didn't hesitate. With a breath she barely remembered taking, she pushed through them and stepped outside. The cold air hit her like a wave, sharp and bracing against her burning skin. It was an unforgiving contrast to the stifling heat of judgment that had filled the ceremony hall just moments before. Her hands trembled, though whether it was from anger or heartbreak, she didn't know. Maybe it was both. Maybe it didn't matter. Behind her, the heavy doors remained ajar. The low murmur of voices spilled out into the afternoon air, a tide of whispers and speculation that would soon turn into a storm of gossip. She could already picture it, how the story would spread like wildfire among the city's elite, twisting itself into something unrecognizable. Sophia Carter, the bride who walked away, the woman who almost married into one of the wealthiest families in the state, until, of course, she was caught stealing. The accusation itself was laughable. She had spent years building herself up, working twice as hard for half the recognition, proving her worth in rooms that had never been meant for her. And yet, in a single moment, Victoria Calloway had unraveled it all with just a suggestion. A carefully placed accusation wrapped in velvet and whispered in front of an audience that was all too willing to believe it. A movement beside her pulled her from the spiral of her thoughts. Rachel was there, her best friend's face tight with fury, her fingers curled into fists at her sides, as if she were barely restraining herself from marching back inside and tearing Victoria apart, piece by piece. "I swear to God," Rachel hissed, "I am this close to losing my mind right now. That woman—" "Not worth it," Sophia murmured, shaking her head. Rachel let out a sharp breath. "She planned this," she said, her voice low but seething. "You know that, right? She orchestrated the entire thing, the timing, the way she presented it. She knew exactly what she was doing." Sophia knew. She had known from the moment Victoria had stepped forward, her voice dripping with carefully measured concern, her expression a mask of maternal regret. The woman was a master manipulator, a queen on a chessboard who never moved first, never struck outright but instead laid out the pieces just so, making sure that when the fall came, it would look like an accident. The fall had come, and now the choice was hers. Stay down or get up. A second set of footsteps thundered down the steps behind them. Sophia didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Sophia, wait," Ethan. Her fingers clenched instinctively around the engagement ring, its sharp edges pressing into her skin. She inhaled deeply before turning to face him. Ethan's face was pale, his expression wrecked with something close to desperation. He looked at her, then at the ring in her hand, as if he still couldn't fully grasp what was happening. "Soph, please, just—" He reached for her hand, but she took a step back before he could touch her. He stopped, his jaw tightening. "We can talk about this." She let out a hollow laugh. "Talk about what, Ethan?" Her voice was even, but there was steel underneath it. "About how your mother stood up in front of everyone and accused me of stealing? About how you just stood there?" Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I didn't know what to say." The words stung, though she had expected them. "You should have known," she whispered. Ethan flinched as if she had physically struck him. "Sophia, I was in shock. I didn't expect—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "I just wanted to make sure we handled it the right way." Sophia's throat tightened. "The right way?" She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You should have shut it down right then, without thinking, without hesitating. But you didn't." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out, and that, more than anything, was answer enough. From the corner of her eye she saw her father watching, his expression unreadable, but his stance rigid, like a soldier waiting for the inevitable impact of a battle that had already been lost. Beside him, her mother stood still, her lips pressed together, her hands clasped as if holding herself back from stepping between them. Rachel, on the other hand, had had enough. "You don't get to ask her for anything right now," she snapped at Ethan. "Not after what you let happen in there." Ethan ignored her, his eyes locked onto Sophia's. "I love you," he said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "That hasn't changed." Sophia swallowed. "Maybe not, but it's not enough." The words settled between them like a final nail in the coffin. Ethan's face crumpled. "Sophia!" She shook her head. "Go back inside, Ethan." He stared at her for a long moment, as if searching for something. One last chance, one last opening. But there was nothing left. With slow, deliberate movements, Sophia extended her hand and placed the engagement ring in his palm. His fingers curled around it instinctively, but he didn't move, didn't speak. She turned away. Rachel was already stepping forward, linking their arms, guiding her down the steps. Behind them, her parents followed, her father solid and silent, her mother's hand ghosting over her back in quiet support. Ethan didn't call out for her again, and she didn't look back. The city swallowed them whole. They didn't go back to the hotel right away. Rachel, in her infinite wisdom, knew that returning to a room filled with wedding gifts and flowers would be unbearable. Instead, she led Sophia to a small cafe a few blocks away, one of those quiet, tucked-away places where no one would recognize her as the bride who had just walked away from her wedding. The moment they stepped inside, the cafe owner, a kind-looking older woman, took one look at Sophia's wedding dress, the raw emotion still clinging to her features, and said nothing. She simply led them to a booth in the back and placed a pot of tea in front of them before retreating without a word. Rachel slid into the seat across from her, watching her carefully. "You did the right thing." Sophia let out a slow breath, staring down at the teacup in front of her. "Then why does it feel like I just lost everything?" Rachel's expression softened. "Because endings suck, even the right ones." Sophia swallowed hard, nodding, but the ache in her chest didn't lessen. She had loved Ethan. Loved him so deeply, so completely that she had ignored every red flag, convinced herself that love would be enough to bridge the gap between her and the life she had never truly belonged to. But love wasn't supposed to feel like something that needed to be proven. She had spent years trying to fit into a world that had never wanted her, fighting battles that should never have needed to be fought. And today, finally, she had laid down her weapons. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time, she was choosing herself. The car ride was silent, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional quiet breath Sophia took, as if reminding herself to keep breathing. She sat in the back seat, her hands resting limply in her lap, her wedding dress pooling around her in folds of pristine white. A cruel irony. A dress meant to symbolize a future, now nothing more than a hollow reminder of what had just unraveled. Rachel sat beside her, her fingers drumming restlessly against her thigh, her body tense with barely contained fury. Jonathan and Laura sat in the front, her father's grip tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set like stone. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Sophia let her head rest against the cool window, her eyes tracing the blur of the city streets. People moved on the sidewalks, lost in their own lives, their own stories, completely unaware that just a few blocks away, a wedding had crumbled to dust. A woman had walked away from a life she had spent years trying to build, from a man she had convinced herself was her forever. Her fingers curled into the delicate lace of her dress. She wasn't sure if the ache in her chest was heartbreak or relief. The car pulled up in front of the hotel, its towering glass structure gleaming under the afternoon sun. A place that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. She could already imagine what waited inside. Flower arrangements, wedding gifts, a bed covered in silk sheets that had been meant for a honeymoon suite. Everything meticulously planned for a future that no longer existed. Rachel was the first to move, stepping out of the car with sharp, purposeful movements. She didn't wait for Sophia to follow, rounding the car and pulling open the door. "Come on," she said, softer this time. Though her eyes still burned with anger, Sophia hesitated before stepping out. The moment her feet hit the pavement, it felt real. She wasn't dreaming. She hadn't imagined the moment. She had pulled the engagement ring off her finger. She had left him. She had left it all. The hotel lobby was quieter than she expected, though a few guests turned to look as she walked through, her wedding dress trailing behind her, her veil clutched loosely in one hand. An employee at the front desk did a double take, but wisely said nothing. Rachel led the way to the elevator, stabbing the button with more force than necessary. "I'll handle it," she muttered. Sophia blinked, her mind sluggish. "Handle what? The roux?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "We're not going up there. You don't need to see it." For a moment Sophia considered arguing, but the thought of stepping into that room, of being surrounded by everything that was supposed to be the beginning of her new life, made her stomach twist. She swallowed. Where are we going, then? Rachel glanced at her. Somewhere else. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside. Sophia followed without hesitation. Rachel booked them a suite on another floor. It wasn't as grand as the bridal suite, but it didn't need to be. It was free of memories. That was enough. Sophia stood in the middle of the unfamiliar space, exhaling slowly. She was still in her dress, the weight of it suffocating. Rachel, as if sensing her thoughts, crossed the room in 2 quick strides and reached for the zipper. "Let's get you out of this thing." Sophia didn't protest as Rachel carefully unfastened the intricate buttons and slid the fabric from her shoulders. The moment the gown pooled at her feet, she felt lighter. Rachel grabbed one of the hotel's robes and draped it over her. "Sit," she said, pointing at the edge of the bed. Sophia obeyed. Rachel crouched in front of her, her sharp green eyes studying Sophia's face. "What do you need?" The question was simple, but Sophia didn't have an answer. She needed everything to stop spinning. She needed to go back and undo the last few hours, to wake up and have everything be different. She needed to not feel like she was drowning in something she couldn't even name. But she couldn't have any of that. "I don't know," she admitted. Rachel nodded as if she had expected that. "Okay." Then, without another word, she pulled Sophia into a hug. Sophia hadn't cried. Not at the altar, not in the car, not in the elevator. But now, with Rachel's arms wrapped tightly around her, the dam broke. Silent, shuddering sobs racked her body. She gripped Rachel's shirt like it was the only thing keeping her grounded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rachel didn't say anything. She just held on, letting Sophia break, letting her fall apart. When the storm finally passed, Sophia pulled back, her face damp, her chest hollow. She wiped at her cheeks with the sleeve of her robe. "Sorry, don't be stupid," Rachel said, but her voice was gentle. A knock at the door made them both stiffen. Rachel was up in a flash, her posture instantly defensive. "If that's him," Sophia swallowed. "It won't be." Rachel shot her a doubtful look before yanking open the door. It wasn't Ethan. It was her parents. Jonathan and Laura stepped inside, and the moment her mother saw her, she let out a soft, relieved breath and cupped Sophia's face. "Oh, sweetheart." Sophia's throat tightened again. Jonathan stood nearby, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unwavering. "You did the right thing." Sophia searched his face, looking for any trace of uncertainty. She found none. "But I loved him," she whispered. Jonathan nodded once. "And he let you walk away." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She inhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a moment. Then, finally, she nodded. The messages came in waves. At first, long paragraphs, pleading, apologizing, explanations that didn't matter anymore. Then, shorter messages. "Just tell me you're okay. Please, Soph, don't shut me out." And finally, the last one. "I don't know how to fix this, but I love you." She stared at that one the longest. Then she deleted them all. Rachel took care of everything, making sure the bridal suite was cleared out, handling the inevitable cancellations, fielding the flood of inquiries from people who wanted to know what happened. Sophia barely lifted a finger. Her parents stayed close. Her father made phone calls, ensuring that no one from the Calloway family would try to contact her directly. Her mother hovered, not overbearing but present. Rachel, of course, was a force of nature. swearing, pacing, ranting about how she should have thrown Victoria Calloway into a fountain before they had left the church. Sophia appreciated the distraction, but by the third day, she knew she couldn't stay like this. She had spent her whole life pushing forward. She had fought for her education, her career, her independence. She had built herself into a woman who refused to be made small. And yet, one family, one man, had managed to make her feel like a stranger in her own life. She wouldn't let that happen. That night, as she sat on the hotel balcony staring out at the city lights, she made a decision. She wasn't going back to Ethan. She wasn't going back to that apartment. She wasn't going back to the life she had meticulously planned. She was going somewhere else. The next morning, she called her boss. When he answered, his voice was warm, cautious. "Sophia, I wanted to give you time, but I need to take a leave of absence," she said, cutting straight to the point. A pause, then, carefully, "For how long?" She exhaled. "I don't know yet." Another pause, then, "Whatever you need, your job will be here when you get back." Relief flooded her. "Thank you," she murmured. She hung up and set her phone aside. Rachel, lounging on the bed, raised an eyebrow. "So, where are we going?" Sophia hesitated. Then, slowly, she smiled. "I don't know yet." The airport was buzzing with movement, voices overlapping in a dozen different languages, the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases against polished floors, the occasional chime of boarding announcements cutting through the air. Sophia stood at the terminal, her fingers curled tightly around the handle of her suitcase, her heart pounding with an anticipation she couldn't quite name. This wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was the quiet, electrifying realization that for the first time in years, she had no idea what came next. Her parents were there, standing beside her, though they both wore expressions that told her they were still adjusting to the idea of her leaving. Her mother, Laura, had barely let go of her hand since they'd arrived, squeezing it every few minutes as if to reassure herself that Sophia was still there. Jonathan, ever the steady force, simply stood with his arms crossed, his unreadable gaze flicking between his daughter and the boarding gate ahead. And then, of course, there was Rachel. She had been the loudest about the whole thing, ranting about how unfair it was that she wasn't coming along, but Sophia knew she understood. Even now, her best friend was smirking through her frustration, arms folded across her chest, like she was considering one last attempt to stop this from happening. "This is insane," Rachel said, shaking her head. "Do you realize that? You're literally running off into the unknown with no plan," Sophia smiled. "I know." Rachel let out an exaggerated sigh, throwing her hands in the air. "At least tell me you'll send me pictures. And if you meet some hot island man, I demand details." Sophia laughed. A real, genuine laugh that felt like the first one in days. Her mother exhaled, finally letting go of her hand to tuck a strand of hair behind Sophia's ear. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, though there was no judgment in her voice, only worry. Sophia nodded. "I have to be." Her father was the last to speak. He didn't offer a speech, didn't try to convince her to stay. Instead, he simply looked at her, his voice calm, firm. "You're doing what's right for you. That's all that matters." She swallowed, her throat tight. A final boarding call echoed over the speakers. It was time. Sophia picked up her suitcase, turning to them one last time. Rachel huffed. "You better come back, and if you don't, I'm finding you." Her mother pulled her into a tight hug. Her father gave her a single nod. And then, with one last deep breath, Sophia turned toward the gate and walked away. She didn't look back. The first thing she noticed when she stepped off the plane was the warmth. It was different from the city heat she had known all her life. This wasn't the suffocating weight of judgment, the heavy press of expectations she had carried for years. This was something else, something lighter, freer, as if the air itself carried the scent of possibility. The island stretched out before her in colors too vivid to be real. The deep blues of the ocean, the golden glow of the sand, the lush greens of palm trees swaying lazily in the breeze. It was as if she had stepped into a dream. Except, it was real, and for the first time in weeks, maybe even years, she felt like she could breathe. She made her way through the small, open-air airport, where a handful of travelers moved at a leisurely pace. The energy here so starkly different from the chaos she had left behind. Near the exit, a man stood holding a handwritten sign with her name. "Sophia?" he asked when she approached. She nodded. "That's me." He smiled. "Welcome." There was something in the way he said it, something so simple and genuine that made her believe it. The drive to the guest house was quiet, save for the occasional soft conversation with the driver, who told her about the island, about the beaches, the hidden trails, the best places to watch the sunset. She listened, but mostly she watched. The world outside the window was so different from the one she had left behind. Here there were no high-rise buildings, no cold, polished surfaces, just open skies, winding roads, and the endless stretch of ocean meeting the horizon. When they arrived, the guest house was exactly what she had hoped for. Small, tucked away from the main resorts, with a wraparound porch that faced the sea. A woman likely in her 50s stood at the entrance, waiting. "You must be Sophia," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Celeste." Sophia offered a tired but grateful smile. "Nice to meet you." Celeste studied her for a moment, her sharp yet kind eyes taking in the details that Sophia hadn't even voiced yet. "You look like someone who needs to rest," she observed. Sophia let out a small, breathy laugh. "That obvious?" Celeste smiled knowingly. "Sometimes. We don't realize how heavy things are until we set them down." Sophia nodded, taking the keys from her hand. She didn't unpack right away. Instead, she walked out onto the porch, letting the sound of the waves fill the silence in her mind. She had spent so long planning her life down to the smallest detail, creating schedules, meeting expectations, following paths that had already been set for her. But here, there were no expectations, no roles to play, no one to prove herself to. For the first time, she wasn't running toward something. She was just here, and that was enough. The days blurred together in the most peaceful way. She spent mornings walking along the beach, feeling the sand between her toes, letting the ocean lap at her ankles. The first few days, her mind was still restless, filled with echoes of the past, of Ethan, of the wedding, of everything she had left behind. But slowly, the thoughts began to quiet. She let herself exist without purpose, without expectation. She let the waves pull away the pieces of her that still clung to the past. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, she sat on the beach with a notebook in her lap. She hadn't written since before the wedding. Writing had always been her escape, a way to make sense of things, but for weeks she had avoided it, afraid that putting words to paper would make everything too real. Now she picked up the pen. She didn't write about Ethan, or the wedding, or the betrayal. She wrote about the ocean, about the way it moved with a certainty she envied. She wrote about the island, about the way the air smelled like salt and promise. She wrote about herself, about the way she was slowly learning to exist outside of what had been expected of her. She wrote about freedom, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to explain herself. She just was. As she sat there, lost in thought, she didn't notice someone approaching until she heard a voice. "You look like someone who's thinking too much." She turned, startled, and saw a man standing a few feet away. He was holding a camera, the kind with a worn leather strap slung over his shoulder. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, his skin sun-warmed, his smile easy. "Sorry," he said, lifting a hand in apology. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Sophia closed her notebook, offering a small smile. "It's okay. I guess I am thinking too much." He nodded, stepping a little closer. "Happens to the best of us." There was something unassuming about him, something easy. He didn't ask why she was here, didn't pry or offer unsolicited advice. Instead, he looked out at the ocean, raised his camera, and snapped a picture. "You take a lot of photos?" she asked. He grinned. "Yeah. Helps me remember things the way I want to." She considered that. "You don't trust your memory?" He glanced at her, something thoughtful in his expression. "I think sometimes we remember things wrong, or we let ourselves forget the good parts because the bad parts take up too much space." Sophia looked back at the ocean, considering his words. Maybe that was what she had been doing, letting the bad parts take up too much space. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, a vast, unbroken horizon painted in deep blues and streaks of gold from the setting sun. Sophia sat with her knees drawn up, her notebook resting in her lap, fingers idly tapping the pen against the paper. She hadn't written a single word in the past 10 minutes, her thoughts caught somewhere between the gentle lull of the waves and the echo of the stranger's words. Sometimes we remember things wrong, or we let ourselves forget the good parts because the bad parts take up too much space. The stranger, the man with the camera, hadn't stayed long. He had taken a picture, exchanged a few words with her, then walked away, his figure disappearing down the shoreline. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked what she was running from. And yet, his words lingered. Sophia exhaled slowly, dragging the pen across the page. What if I've been remembering everything wrong? She had spent so long replaying the betrayal, the hesitation in Ethan's voice, the way Victoria had smiled, as if she had been expecting the moment Sophia broke. Those memories had consumed her, filling every empty space in her mind, demanding to be replayed over and over again. But what about the good parts? Had she let them slip away? She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the island wrap around her, the whisper of the tide, the distant call of seabirds, the rustling of palm leaves swaying in the evening breeze. She had come here to escape, to get away from everything. But maybe what she really needed wasn't to escape. Maybe she needed to rewrite it. Sophia let out a breath and finally began to write. She didn't write about the wedding, or Ethan, or Victoria. Instead, she wrote about now, about the feel of the sand beneath her fingertips, about the way the sun melted into the sea, turning the water into a canvas of fire and gold, about the scent of salt in the air, thick and real, grounding her in the present. She wrote about herself, about how she had spent years trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for her, fighting battles that shouldn't have needed to be fought. She wrote about the realization that had hit her the moment she had stepped off the plane. She wasn't lost. She was free. A shadow fell across the page. Sophia blinked, looking up. The man with the camera was back. He stood a few feet away, watching her with a curious tilt of his head. His dark hair was windswept, his tanned skin glowing in the fading light. The camera strap hung loosely from his shoulder, fingers resting against the body of the worn, well-loved device. She arched a brow. "You again?" He grinned. "Me again." Sophia set her notebook aside, crossing her arms. "Do you just make a habit of sneaking up on people?" "Not usually," he said, stepping a little closer. "But you looked like someone who needed a second chance to answer my question." She frowned. "What question?" He gestured toward her notebook. "Are you thinking too much?" Sophia let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I think I've been thinking about the wrong things." His expression shifted slightly, a flicker of understanding passing through his gaze. He nodded toward the book. "Writing helps?" She glanced down at the page, the ink still fresh. "It used to." He lowered himself onto the sand a few feet away, resting his elbows on his knees. "And now?" Sophia hesitated, then shrugged. "Now, I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." He smiled, slow and knowing. "Aren't we all?" There was something about the way he said it, as if he understood exactly what she meant. She studied him for a moment. "Do you live here?" He shook his head. "Just visiting." "Where from?" He smirked. "Everywhere." Sophia rolled her eyes. "That's not an answer." "It's the best one I've got," he said with a chuckle. "I travel a lot, take pictures, write articles, move on to the next place. A photographer, a traveler, a man untethered to any one place." "Must be nice," she murmured. He tilted his head. "You say that like you can't do the same." Sophia huffed a quiet laugh. I don't think I'm built for that." He raised a brow. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because I always thought I had a plan. I knew what my life was supposed to look like. I built it carefully, piece by piece." His gaze flickered to her, unreadable. "And now?" She let out a slow breath, staring at the waves. "Now, I don't know anymore." He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was thoughtful. "Maybe that's a good thing." She looked at him, curiosity sparking in her chest. "And why is that?" "Because plans are just expectations in disguise," he said simply. "And expectations have a way of turning into cages." The words hit harder than she expected. Sophia swallowed, glancing back at the water. "What if I don't know how to let go of the plan?" The man smiled. "Then maybe you should start with something small." She raised a brow. "Like what?" He lifted his camera. "Let me take your picture." Sophia blinked. "Just one," he said. "Not posed, not planned, just you, right now, as you are." She hesitated. The instinct to say no was immediate, automatic. But then she thought about it. For years, she had existed in a life that had been carefully curated. She had played the role of the woman who was supposed to be good enough, proper enough, perfect enough for Ethan's world. Every step, every decision had been measured, calculated, designed to fit an image that wasn't entirely her own. And now, here she was, miles away from that life, sitting on an island she hadn't planned on visiting, having a conversation with a stranger who didn't know anything about her past. For the first time in a long time, there was no expectation, no script, no weight of judgment hanging over her. Just the ocean, and the possibility of something new. Slowly she nodded. The man lifted his camera, his movements unhurried. The setting sun cast a golden glow against her skin, the breeze catching loose strands of her hair. He clicked the shutter once. Then he lowered the camera, studying the image for a moment before glancing at her. "There," he said with a satisfied nod. "No expectations, just you." Sophia exhaled, something shifting in her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe plans were just cages disguised as certainty. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let go. The days passed in a way Sophia had never experienced before. Slow, unhurried, untethered from schedules or obligations. There was no rush, no expectations. The world she had known, the one filled with constant pressure to be enough, to fit into spaces never meant for her, felt like a distant memory. She found herself waking up to the soft glow of the sunrise spilling through the wooden shutters of her guest house, the sound of the waves lapping at the shore just beyond her balcony. Mornings were spent walking along the coastline, her feet sinking into the warm sand, letting the ocean pull away pieces of her that she no longer needed. At first, she had thought the silence would be unbearable, that without the constant hum of city noise, without work calls and wedding plans and carefully curated expectations, her thoughts would consume her. But they didn't. Instead, they settled. She let herself exist without questioning what came next. And for the first time in a long time, she felt light. She spent afternoons in the open-air markets, wandering between stalls overflowing with ripe mangoes and fragrant spices, chatting with locals who greeted her like she belonged. She let herself get lost in side streets that led to quiet, hidden cafes, where she would sit with her notebook, writing, not about the past, not about Ethan or Victoria or the wedding that never was, but about what she saw, the way the air smelled like salt and sun, the laughter of children playing barefoot in the sand, the way time seemed to stretch and bend in a place that had no need for deadlines. She hadn't expected to see him again, the man with the camera, and yet he appeared at the market, at the cafe, on the beach where she had first met him, always with that easy, knowing smile and that worn leather strap slung over his shoulder. He never asked too many questions, never pushed. Instead, he would sit with her, sipping coffee or flipping through his camera roll, sharing stories about the places he had been, the people he had met. His name, she learned, was Lucas. Not her Lucas, not the one she had almost married. But maybe that was the irony of it. Where one had been hesitant, uncertain, built of polite restraint and expectations, this Lucas was something else entirely. Unburdened, untamed, free. She envied that about him. One evening, as the sky melted into deep purples and oranges, they sat by the shoreline, watching the waves roll in and out, their conversation drifting as easily as the tide. "You ever going back?" he asked, his voice thoughtful, not pressing. Sophia hugged her knees to her chest, considering the question. The old her, the version of herself that had existed before, would have answered without hesitation. Of course, she would go back. She had built a life there, had responsibilities, a job waiting for her. But now she wasn't so sure. She glanced at him. "Do you ever go back? Anywhere?" Lucas smirked, shaking his head. "Not really. I don't think I'm wired that way." Why not? His gaze flickered toward the horizon. Because I like the unknown. Sophia let out a small, thoughtful hum. Whew, that's terrifying. Or liberating. She glanced down at her hands, tracing invisible patterns in the sand. I used to think I had everything figured out, she admitted. That if I followed all the right steps, did everything I was supposed to, my life would turn out the way I planned it. Lucas didn't say anything, just watched her, waiting. She exhaled slowly. But now, I don't even know if I want that life anymore. There, she had said it, the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment she had walked out of that church. Lucas grinned, nudging her lightly with his shoulder. Then don't go back to it. She huffed a quiet laugh. It's not that simple. Isn't it? He countered. You're not trapped. You're not tied to anything. You're here, right now. That means you chose to be here. You can choose what comes next, too. Sophia bit her lip, staring at the waves. The idea of staying, of choosing something new, something unplanned, was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. I don't know where to start, she admitted. Lucas leaned back on his elbows, looking up at the sky. Start small. Like what? He gestured toward her notebook. Write about the future, not the past. She considered that for a long moment. Then, slowly, she flipped open to a blank page. And she began to write. Not about Ethan, not about Victoria, not about the wedding, but about possibility, about waking up with the sun warming her skin, about chasing sunsets without knowing where they'd lead, about learning to exist without waiting for permission, about choosing herself. She didn't know how long she sat there, her pen gliding across the pages, but when she finally looked up, Lucas was watching her with an amused tilt of his head. What? She asked. He smirked. You look different. Sophia raised a brow. Different how? Lucas shrugged. Lighter. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You always say things like that? Only when they're true. She closed her notebook, tucking it under her arm. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't writing just to make sense of something that had already happened. She was writing for something new, something more. The thought settled in her chest, warm and certain. She didn't have to have all the answers right now. She didn't have to know exactly what came next. All she had to do was choose. And this time, she was choosing herself. That night, as she lay in bed with the window open, the distant sound of waves lulling her into sleep, she reached for her phone and sent a single message. I think I'm staying a little longer. Rachel's response was immediate. Good. You deserve this. Sophia smiled, setting the phone aside. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into a world that had never truly wanted her, fighting to be enough for people who would never see her that way. But now, for the first time, she wasn't trying to fit anywhere. She just was. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Thank you for staying until the very end of Sophia's journey. Stories like this remind us of something truly important. Sometimes, walking away is not a sign of failure, but of strength. Sophia thought she had her entire life planned out. She believed love meant proving herself, fitting into spaces that weren't built for her, and enduring things that shouldn't have to be endured. But in the end, she realized something powerful. Love should never come with conditions, and self-worth is not something others get to decide for you. This story isn't just about heartbreak. It's about rediscovery, about choosing yourself, even when it's terrifying, about knowing when to let go of what no longer serves you so you can step into something better. Maybe some of you have been in Sophia's shoes. Maybe you've had to make a difficult choice, walk away from something that once felt like your whole world. Or maybe, like Sophia, you're just beginning to figure out what comes next. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming soon. See you next time.